Thank you so much, Dr. Insel, and thank you to the Zuckerman Institute for inviting me to speak this evening. Let's see. So in this talk, I hope to complicate a few conceptual ideas about education. And to begin, I'd like you all to take a moment and think back over this previous year during this long pandemic and all that's been asked of us. Can you remember a time when you found yourself appreciating an experience that you previously maybe considered mundane? I remember going on my first walk at the start of the pandemic in early April. I had a doctor's appointment, so I felt as if I'd been given permission to go outside, but very few other people had emerged from quarantining. And I felt almost alone as I walked through Central Park. I was so shocked to see that spring had arrived while we were all indoors. And as I took a simple walk through the park, I was startled again and again by my senses. There was an assault of sounds from a cello player in that tunnel leading to Bethesda Fountain. He could barely compete with the bird song. It was so loud, I thought for sure there were 1,000 birds nesting in the tunnel eaves. And then I found myself under an explosion of color from blooming magnolia trees. And I slowed my pace almost to the point of leisure, and I cried. It was an emotional backdrop for so much grief and hope that I was holding in my body and in my mind. I'm not sure I knew at the time what an important experience that was, but since then I can recognize how that walk reflects a shift in my expectations for teaching and learning during these times and in the future. In the field of curriculum studies, we probe questions about what knowledge is worth knowing, worth teaching, and where and how that should take place. We help educators complicate the taken for granted assumptions that are presumed from standards documents or national assessments, or even global expectations for 21st century learners. In my work, I'm interested in helping educators push the boundaries on who might be involved in these conversations and what might emerge as a result of disrupting the answers we have always assumed. And I take up these ideas in the courses that I teach and in a research space called the Black Paint Curriculum Lab that I founded in 2017 with my colleague, Professor Nancy Lesko, in the Curriculum and Teaching Department at Teachers College. We call the activities of the lab black paint for the metaphor of remaking surfaces that are meant to be written on, erased, and then remade again. We're interested in ways to involve public audiences in the deeper conversations about knowledge and how knowledge sits in all sorts of spaces, including schools, but not limited to schools. I always like to begin by defining terms. So let me start with what exactly is curriculum. First, there is the formal curriculum, the official, explicit, or written curriculum that most people think of. This is the intentional instructional agenda that includes curriculum documents like lesson plans, textbooks, and what's mandated by standards or tests to define what students are expected to learn. There's also the informal or the hidden curriculum, which is implied by the social context of the learning environment. And this is about the kind of knowledge and learning derived from the daily routines, the design of a classroom, and how students are expected to inhabit that space, and the attitudes of teachers and administrators towards students. Examples of the informal curriculum include student behavior, expectations that regulate children's bodies to sit up straight, to do seat work quietly, raise your hand before being called on to speak. The informal curriculum is sometimes made explicit, though often it's hidden, communicated with a raised eyebrow or a nod, but like the formal curriculum, it's usually intended. The null curriculum, that's about what we do not teach, what is not talked about, what is ignored in the formal and informal curriculum that still teaches powerful lessons. For example, the reality that many of the schools where students spend more time mastering rigid behavioral guidelines rather than learning new content can be found in under-resourced Black and Brown communities where students of color have fewer educational options. So the null curriculum teaches those students in education in compliance and order rather than one of imagination and discovery. Unlike the formal and hidden curriculum, the lessons of the null curriculum are not always intended, although it teaches nonetheless. So as you consider all these forms of curriculum, understand that both what we choose to teach and what we neglect to teach has consequences for the kinds of lives students lead, the futures they can imagine, and the goals they might seek to attain. Another term I'd like to define is pedagogy. The typical definition is the method and practice of teaching. In the curriculum lab, we understand that in pedagogy, there's always an interaction between the teacher and the learner and knowledge. So rather than think of pedagogy as something that only the teacher does, we're interested in how all learners are engaged in pedagogical actions when they consider knowledge in relation to the self and to others, in relation to spaces and the activities happening around them, in relation to social context. This encourages me to think about pedagogical approaches outside of the classroom too, and to consider how curriculum and pedagogy are relevant to populations beyond school-age children, such as with adults and in public spaces. So this shift in mindset about who education is for is consequential, and it has the potential to enrich learning opportunities for young people everywhere. So how does the Black Paint Curriculum Lab work with these ideas? Well, most people think of a lab and they think of researchers wearing lab coats, peering into microscopes. Our research space is quite different. It's centered around dialogue and experience. The Curriculum Lab is a research and design space where students, faculty, and alumni from our curriculum and teaching programs explore complex social problems like what to teach students during the pandemic, not just how to get the content delivered, but whether and how to integrate the emotional reactions to the rising infection rates and isolation, or whether and how to address the concurrent crisis of racial protests and the attempted government overthrow. You know, our aim is to use qualitative research methods in more speculative ways to encourage deep thinking and creativity in educational encounters. And by speculative, I mean we are drawn to how qualitative inquiry methods are like pedagogy in relation to the self, in relation to others, to spaces and activities and context. So we meet weekly for outings where we explore the city, to look at art, to wander through streets and parks, to notice and feel. Really, we see any place where people are able to find, question, and apply knowledge as a pedagogical space. And we pay attention to how knowledge is sensed through affect, memory, emotion, and movement. University of Toronto researchers Stephanie Springay and Sarah Truman call these more speculative methodologies being, quote, in the middle of a research event, by shifting the intent of our inquiry away from finding certain answers and solutions and towards more innovative knowledge and intentions that have yet to be imagined. So we're on the lookout for knowledge that sits in that place of the unknown. You might call it seeking possibilities. And in the lab, we don't publish findings in typical ways. We take the complex ideas that arise and we present this research in the form of curricula for participatory learning experiences. So we see our research outcomes as actually designing pedagogical activities that remake conceptions of the curriculum for school-age students and teachers, and also for non-academic public audiences. So here's an example. This is a pre-pandemic event where Raquel Vigil, a graduate of our program, guided us through experiential walking, sensing, and mapping activities around Columbia's Manhattanville campus. The goal was to create a dialogue about the impact of development and the inherent tensions between constructed places and community needs. And a more recent event during the pandemic took advantage of Ellen Reed's Sound Walk, which is an immersive audio experience to accompany wandering in Central Park while observing social distancing guidelines. Anyone can download a free app and it will prompt music compositions by the New York Philharmonic and the Young People's Chorus of New York City, a few other performers, and it shifts and changes as you move through the park. So throughout the day, our participants received prompts to post what they were seeing, hearing, and feeling in a shared WhatsApp group. Now, this attention to the senses is a way that our official curriculum might acknowledge attunement to that experience I described at the start of my talk. The contrast between my walk in those early pandemic days was striking in its similarity. As one of our participants said, the music encouraged, quote, slowing down and almost hyper-attentiveness to the surroundings. Another person was taken by how aimless walking led her to pass places and see details she'd never noticed before. Later, as we processed this, we were compelled to ask, what is gained from slowing down? How does knowledge enter in different ways when multiple senses are activated simultaneously? Can certain sounds like soothing classical music or that staccato of children's spoken word poetry, can that foster different kinds of openness to new ideas and experiences? And how might we apply this to teaching students in school environments? Most of us in the lab go back to some more structured learning organization, public and private schools. I go back to my university classroom to implement the ideas that come out of these events with students and teachers. And our ideas are sometimes concrete. They are often aspirational. We may or may not be able to immediately implement new content or a teaching strategy, but our orientation to knowledge is always changed. This is important because teachers don't always have the freedom to influence the formal curriculum, but we can pay attention to our choices in the hidden curriculum, and we can try to uncover the null effects of our intentions. And many of the speculative strategies that I've been talking about could also be described as multimodal learning. This refers to how information is experienced or felt, verbally, visually, orally, spatially, temporally, and physically. Multimodal pedagogies like walking, drawing, and mapping, and using media technologies to present or produce work all spark sensory experiences that can have a powerful force on learning. And we're experimenting with ways to build on this to support our current mode of research. Since the pandemic, we've been meeting weekly in a virtual space to dialogue on Zoom. This is just a portion of our group here. You might be surprised to hear that we actually found our stride during the pandemic, because like that slow walk through the park, having nothing but the virtual meeting space forced us to slow down and really pay attention to the pedagogy that worked for us in this new realm. After several months, we've uncovered a few dialogue practices from the hidden curriculum that we seem to rely on. And I want to share them with the caveat that ours is a very flexible learning environment, and it took time to come to these approaches. We've not yet studied how to translate these practices to schools with different needs and realities. First, we have a practice of keeping our mics and videos open if possible. And we found that being tolerant of the ambient background noises that are a part of it's a part of our relationship building. It invites more spontaneous contributions. You know, we're intentionally trying to disrupt the limitations of virtual relationship building, where turning off microphones and cameras support that impulse to stay quiet, to not interrupt and let somebody else lead. And also the assumption that breaching the boundary between personal and school lives is taboo. We also usually provide a prompt to guide introductions. One person answers and then calls on the next person. And that supports this culture of invitation and curiosity and care. We let each other speak. We allow people to finish their thoughts, complete their sentences. And often that leads to a moment of uncomfortable silence while others wait to see if the speaker has finished. There's something gained in the time to follow a thought to a natural stopping point. There's always more to say, but the ability to talk through unformed or uncomfortable ideas with interested listeners is such a gift that's not always found in the typical task-oriented learning environment. We also hold each other accountable. There was a moment last week when a nervous participant felt the need to call out another for an offhand remark that was deeply wounding. And it was affecting for us all to witness the bravery that it took to be vulnerable and to take a risk, to defend the emotionality that we're so often making space for. And we also permit the dialogue to wander through topics. Our conversations continue in the chat and on a Padlet, and across both platforms, we encourage fresh connections, questions, reflections, both during and after the meeting. So here's an example of our Padlet. What's interesting is that wandering through ideas allows us to pay attention to the critical questions that arise in the null curriculum, and then make decisions about whether and how we might interpret that for more explicit curricular opportunities. Our members who are classroom teachers say this collaborative time is an unusual freeing space to imagine other kinds of pedagogical approaches that don't get a lot of airtime in their school curriculum planning meetings. And our current research question emerged when the pandemic hit. In the initial days after the college closed and we were all at home self-isolating, all of the typical questions that energize us about education and about our work, it seemed to somehow be disjointed and possibly irrelevant. And that was really complicated for us as passionate educators to think about our usual methods perhaps not working anymore. So the research question, what do we need from curriculum now, has allowed us to move away from all the taken for granted assumptions about teaching and start to just react to things like our emotional state, to our environment, and to our limited access to other people. And we will inevitably end up integrating these ideas into explicit written curriculum, which is the current stage of at least some of our work. During what we call Design Hour, a small group of 5 or 6 of us meet using a tool called Miro, which is a visual collaboration board, a virtual design space. And we brainstorm, we share links to audio and video content that inspires us, and then we use Google Docs to collaboratively write what will eventually be a formal curriculum document with guidance for students and teachers. And given our dialogues in the lab, we're drawn to the themes of imagination, care, grief, and normalcy. We've come to see these as frames of pandemic teaching, anchor points in a curriculum about what it means to teach and learn in the midst of this pandemic. We're building on the principles that I've discussed today, paying attention to the senses, place, and movement to support pedagogical approaches that might otherwise seem strange, and intentionally discuss curricular knowledge that often gets avoided as worth knowing and teaching. To conclude, I'd like to invite anyone listening to experience this with us at our next Black Paint event. Ordinary Publics is a curriculum designed by 2 lab participants, Sarah Vandenberg and Raquel Vihil. It's a card-based curriculum activity, and it's designed to spark creative inquiry into the experiences of public and private spaces during the pandemic. So we'll be participating in that event together virtually in 2 weeks, and anyone is invited to join us by signing up and using the link that you see here. I want to thank you for listening, and I really look forward to the upcoming dialogue with Dr. Devachi and Dr. Dinsel.